That's a $3,000 fine, Mr. Davis, payable within 15 days or it doubles. And I suggest you dismantle that eyesore immediately before we have it dismantled for you and bill you for the labor. The voice belonged to Karen, the president of the Oak Hollow Homeowners Association, a woman whose physical presence was as imposing as her sense of entitlement. She stood on my freshly cut lawn, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, her floral print caftan billowing in the slight breeze, making her look like a hostile parade float that had run aground on my property line. The eyesore she was referring to was my new outdoor shower, a simple, elegant structure of cedar and brushed nickel I'd finished installing just last week. It was tucked discreetly behind a lattice screen overgrown with jasmine, it completely invisible from the street. The only way she could have seen it was by peering down from her second-story bedroom window, a thought that sent a chill of violation down my spine. I'd been a master plumber for 30 years, a Marine before that, and in all my time I'd never encountered a command structure so arbitrary and so utterly disconnected from reality. $3,000 for a shower on my own property. My hand, which had been resting on the handle of the garden spade I was holding, tightened. I could feel the grit of the dirt, the smooth, worn wood. I took a slow breath, letting the initial surge of white-hot anger recede, just as I'd been trained to do. You don't react, you assess. You don't engage, you evaluate. Karen, I said, my voice dangerously calm, there must be some mistake. I reviewed the bylaws before installation. There's no provision against an outdoor shower, especially one that isn't visible from the public right-of-way. She gave a short, barking laugh. Oh, the bylaws, how cute. You think the bylaws are the only rules? Section 7, Article B, Paragraph 4. All exterior modifications, additions, or alterations must be submitted to and approved by the Architectural Review Committee prior to commencement. You didn't submit an application. You didn't get approval. Therefore, you are in violation. It's not complicated. She tapped a perfectly manicured nail on the paper she held out. A fine, a threat, a public dressing down on my own lawn. This was how she operated. This was her power. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly comprehend, was that I wasn't just some retiree who had wandered into her little kingdom. I was the man who had plumbed this entire kingdom. I was the one who held the blueprints, not just to the houses, but to the secrets buried within their walls. Her walls. If you're enjoying this story already, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had your own HOA nightmare, I want to hear about it. Now back to Oak Hollow, where the plumbing was about to get very, very complicated for Karen. She was still talking, her voice droning on about property values and community standards. But I wasn't really listening. I was looking at her house, the big 2-story colonial at the top of the cul-de-sac, and I was remembering. I was remembering the frantic call I got from the developer 15 years ago. The one about needing to get all the plumbing finals passed before the bank released the next round of funding. I remembered the shortcuts we were asked to take, the ones I documented meticulously in my personal logs because my gut told me it would matter someday. And I was remembering a private job, a few years after the development was finished. A frantic, hushed call from Karen herself, wanting a new master bathroom suite, complete with a ridiculously oversized jacuzzi tub that the floor joist could barely support, and a steam shower with more jets than a fighter plane. All done off the books, no permits, no inspections. Because as she'd told me back then, with a conspiratorial wink, the city permitting office is just a bunch of bureaucratic thieves. And besides, who needs their approval when I'm the one who approves everything around here? The irony was so thick, I could have caulked a drain with it. She stood there lecturing me on rules she herself had so flagrantly ignored, fining me with an authority she believed was absolute. She saw a quiet widower puttering in his garden. She had no idea she was picking a fight with the man who held the schematics to her own hypocrisy. 15 days, Mr. Davis, she repeated, her voice sharp, snapping me back to the present. She thrust the violation notice at my chest. I didn't take it. I just looked at her, my expression unreadable. I'll review it, I said, the words clipped. She huffed, her face flushing with indignation that I hadn't immediately capitulated. See that you do. She spun on her heel, the caftan swirling dramatically. Efwin marched back across my lawn, leaving a trail of righteous indignation in her wake. I watched her go, then bent down and picked up the piece of paper she dropped at my feet. $3,000. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. It was about the arrogant, unearned power she wielded like a scepter. She had just declared war, and my training, both in the Corps and in my trade, had taught me one thing. You don't start a war, but if someone starts one with you, you finish it. And I always finish my work. I walked back to my discreet, beautiful, and apparently illegal shower, turned the handle, and let the cool water run over my hands. It was time to go to my workshop. It was time to pull out the old files. My late wife, Sarah, would have found the whole situation darkly hilarious. Oh, she'd had a keen eye for absurdity and a deep-seated suspicion of anyone who craved petty power. When we decided I should move to Oak Hollow after she was gone, it was for one reason: our daughter, Jessica, her husband, Tom, and our granddaughter, Lily. They lived 3 blocks away. After 50 years of moving wherever the Marine Corps or my plumbing business sent us, I wanted to be a grandfather who was just there, for scraped knees, for school plays, for teaching her how to properly solder a copper pipe when she was old enough. The house was perfect, a single-story ranch with a decent-sized yard for a garden. It was smaller than our old place, but I didn't need the space anymore. What I needed was proximity. The HOA was a known quantity, a necessary evil that came with the well-manicured lawns and quiet streets. I'd read the covenants, seen conditions and restrictions before buying. They were dense, filled with legalese, but nothing seemed overly tyrannical. Standard stuff about lawn maintenance, trash can placement, and paint colors. I'd never been one to rock the boat. Keep my head down, my lawn neat, and my property values up. That was the plan. The outdoor shower was part of making this new house my own. It was a small piece of private joy. Sarah and I had always dreamed of having one at a beach house we never got around to buying. Building it felt like honoring a piece of her, a way to wash off the grime of the day, whether from the garden or from the grief that still ambushed me in quiet moments, and feel clean under the open sky. I built it to last, the way I build everything. Ama poured a concrete pad with a French drain system that routed the gray water to a small rock garden, framed the enclosure with pressure-treated lumber, and clad it in tongue-and-groove red cedar. The plumbing was immaculate, of course. Perfectly sloped PEX lines, quarter-turn ball valves, and a high-efficiency tankless water heater that only fired when needed. It was a work of art, hidden from the world. It was for me. After Karen's belligerent departure, I retreated to my garage, which served as my office and workshop. The air smelled of metal, oil, and sawdust. It was my sanctuary. Along the back wall stood a row of gray, fireproof filing cabinets. They contained the records of every job Semperfi Plumbing had ever done, going back to the day I started the company after my honorable discharge. I pulled open the heavy drawer labeled DF, the rollers groaning in protest. I thumbed past Davenport Construction and Eastwood Malls until I found it, a thick series of folders labeled Developer Oak Hollow Estates. A wave of nostalgia, tinged with old frustrations, washed over me. 15 years ago, I was a subcontractor on this project. The developer, a slick guy named Barry, had been all about speed and cost cutting. My company was hired to do the rough-in and final plumbing for all 150 homes in the development. It was a massive, lucrative job, but it was a headache. Barry wanted everything done yesterday, and for half the price it should have cost. "Just get it to pass inspection, Mark," he'd say. "We're not building the Taj Mahal here." But I was building it to my standards. My name was on the permits. My reputation was on the line. I kept 2 sets of records. One was the official set for the developer and the city inspectors. The other, the one I kept for myself, was a detailed log of every deviation, every shortcut I was pressured to take, and every verbal agreement that contradicted the blueprints. I had photos, signed work orders, and personal notes scribbled in the margins. It was my insurance policy. I pulled out the master file for the whole development and the subfolder for Lot 1, Karen's address. Inside were the original blueprints, my handwritten notes, and a thin, separate manila folder simply marked K. Miller, Private. I opened that one first. The memory came flooding back. It was about 5 years after the development was completed. Karen, already the HOA president, had called my personal cell, not the business line. So she wanted a complete remodel of her master bath. A friend had recommended me, she'd said, gushing about my quality work. She also made it very clear she wanted to handle this discreetly. No permits meant no property tax reassessment. No permits meant she could have whatever she wanted. Code be damned. I remembered standing in her bathroom as she described her vision. The jacuzzi tub she wanted was a monster, holding over 100 gallons. I told her the floor joists, standard 2x10s, weren't sufficient to bear the load of the tub, the water, and a person. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she'd scoffed. "Just make it work." I'd ended up sistering the joist from the crawl space below, but I made a note of it. I noted the unvented steam shower unit, a potential mold factory. I noted the new drain lines that were tied into the main stack without proper venting, a clear code violation that could lead to siphon traps and sewer gas in the house. I had advised her against all of it. She had insisted. I did the work as she requested, took her cash payment, and documented every single dangerous, unpermitted, and idiotic thing she'd had me do. I even had the carbon copy of the invoice, where the line item simply read, "Plumbing services rendered," with no details, just a total amount. It was all right here. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. She was fining me for a perfectly safe, well-built shower, while her own bathroom was a monument to code violations that could, in a worst-case scenario, flood her house or make her sick. I closed the private folder and turned my attention to the main development files. I remembered the pressure from Barry about the water heaters. The local code had just been updated to require thermal expansion tanks on all closed-loop plumbing systems. Any system with a check valve or pressure-reducing valve at the main, which Oak Hollow had, the tanks prevent dangerous pressure buildup as water is heated. Barry had already bought 150 water heaters without them. Buying and installing the tanks would have added about $200 to the cost of each home, a $30,000 expense he didn't want. "The inspectors are my buddies, Mark," he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder. "They're not going to crawl into every closet to check for a little tank. Just get the heaters in." I had protested formally in an email. He replied, telling me to proceed as directed and that he, the developer, would assume all liability. And I printed that email and stapled it to my notes. Then I created a master list, every address in Oak Hollow and a checkbox next to it. As my guys installed each water heater without the required expansion tank, they marked it off. 150 houses, 150 ticking time bombs. The HOA, as the successor to the developer, had likely inherited that liability, and Karen, as its president, was the captain of that sinking ship. My heart wasn't racing with anger anymore. It was beating with the slow, steady rhythm of purpose. This was no longer a spat over an outdoor shower. This was a systematic abuse of power by a woman who built her throne on a foundation of hypocrisy. She had just fined a plumber $3,000. She was about to find out what the real cost of bad plumbing was. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen. At the top of the page, I wrote plan of action. It was time to get to work. The first step was to follow the process, no matter how rigged it felt. My training in the Corps taught me the value of procedure. You don't go rogue until you've exhausted all official channels. It gives you the high ground. So I drafted a formal appeal letter to the HOA board. I kept it professional, devoid of emotion. I cited the specific bylaw Karen had quoted, Section 7, Article B, Paragraph 4, regarding exterior modifications. Then I politely dismantled her argument. I attached photographs of my property taken from the street, the sidewalk, and my immediate neighbors' yards, all showing the shower was completely concealed. I argued that a modification implied a change to the existing structure of the house, which this was not. It was a freestanding fixture on my private property. I also pointed to another bylaw, one that guaranteed homeowners the right to quiet enjoyment of their property, and argued that my shower was a fundamental part of that enjoyment. I made 2 copies, one for my records, one for the HOA, and sent it via certified mail with a return receipt requested. Paper trails are everything. The HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening in the community clubhouse. a sterile beige room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and shattered dreams. I arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a pressed button-down shirt and slacks. I wasn't there as a plumber. I was there as a homeowner, a member of the community. I wanted to project calm competence. Karen was seated at the head of a long folding table, flanked by two other board members. A nervous-looking man named Gary, who kept adjusting his tie, and a woman named Brenda who stared at her notes with the intensity of someone trying to decipher ancient runes. About 20 other homeowners were scattered in the metal folding chairs, their expressions ranging from bored to apprehensive. I recognized a few faces, people I'd nodded to while walking my dog. No one met my eye. The meeting began with a tedious recitation of the previous month's minutes, followed by a treasurer's report that seemed to intentionally obscure where the money was going. Then Karen cleared her throat. New business. Case number 2023-14, homeowner Mark Davis, 124 Willow Creek Lane. She said my name and address like she was reading an indictment. Mr. E. Davis has appealed a fine for an unapproved exterior alteration. She held up my letter. The board has reviewed Mr. Davis's appeal. She glanced at Gary and Brenda, who both nodded meekly. And we have found it to be without merit. My stomach tightened, but I kept my face impassive. The argument that the alteration is not visible from the street is irrelevant. The committee's purview is not limited to what is publicly visible. It extends to all alterations on the property to maintain the character and standards of the community. She looked directly at me, a smug little smile playing on her lips. Furthermore, Mr. Davis's failure to submit an application prior to construction demonstrates a clear disregard for the rules that we all agree to live by when we move here. Rules, she said, her voice rising as she addressed the room, key that protect our property values. A few people nodded dutifully. I saw the trap. She was framing this as me versus the community. Me, the rule breaker, against everyone else who followed the rules and wanted their home values protected. Therefore, the board denies the appeal. The original fine of $3,000 stands. She paused for dramatic effect. And due to the homeowner's defiant and uncooperative posture, the board has voted to add an additional fine of $2,000 for failure to cure the violation in a timely manner. The total is now $5,000, Mr. Davis. You have 7 days to pay and dismantle the structure. A collective gasp went through the room. $5,000. It was an absurd, punitive amount. It was designed to crush me, to make an example of me. I stood up slowly. Ma'am, I said, now my voice quiet but carrying in the silent room. May I ask a question of the board? Karen's eyes narrowed. You may. The bylaw you cited refers to exterior modifications. Could the board please provide the definition of modification as it is used in the covenants? Does it, for instance, include a child's swing set, a garden fountain, a barbecue grill? Because none of those require ARC approval, yet they are all technically exterior alterations. Gary fidgeted. Brenda looked down at her papers. Karen's smile vanished. The board is not here to play word games, Mr. Davis. The committee interprets the bylaws as it sees fit to protect the community. So the rules are whatever you decide they are in the moment? I asked, still in that calm, questioning tone. And that sounds less like a community association and more like a dictatorship. The word hung in the air. A few more people were looking at me now, a flicker of something other than fear in their eyes. Karen's face turned a mottled shade of red. That is an outrageous and disrespectful accusation. You are out of order. The decision is final. If the fine is not paid and the structure is not removed, we will place a lien on your property. A lien, the ultimate weapon. It was a threat to my home, my financial security. It was the nuclear option. I see, I said softly. I looked around the room, at the faces of my neighbors. They looked away, studying the scuff marks on the linoleum floor, the water stain on the ceiling tile, anything but the confrontation happening in front of them. They were prisoners in their own homes, so terrified of the warden. I had my answer. The official channels were a dead end. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as Karen intended. It was a tool of intimidation and control. I gave a single, sharp nod. Thank you for clarifying the board's position. I turned and walked out of the clubhouse, the silence behind me heavier than any shouting could have been. The cool night air hit my face. The anger was back, but this time it was cold and sharp, like a shard of ice in my gut. She had threatened my home. She had made it personal. The time for appeals was over. The time for documentation and counteroffensives had begun. When I got home, I called my son-in-law, Tom. He's a corporate lawyer, sharp as a tack, but more importantly, he's family. I explained the situation, from the initial fine to the lien threat, as he was silent for a long moment after I finished. Mark, he said, his voice grim, this is not just a neighborhood dispute anymore. A lien threat is serious. This woman is playing for keeps. I know, I said, looking over at the filing cabinets in my garage. So am I. The battle had shifted from my backyard to the paper-strewn landscape of my dining room table. This was a war of documentation, and I had a 15-year head start on the enemy. Tom had been clear in his advice. Karen's power comes from selective enforcement and the perception of absolute authority. We need to dismantle that perception with undeniable facts. We need to show a pattern of abuse, and we need to hit her where she's legally and financially vulnerable. So my mission began. For 3 days, I lived in my archives. I spread the original Oak Hollow development blueprints across the table, the crisp blue lines a map of the neighborhood's skeleton. Alongside them, I laid out my personal logs, the city's publicly accessible property records I'd downloaded, and the thick binder of HOA covenants and bylaws. It was an intelligence-gathering operation. My first target was Karen's house. I had my own memories in my private folder, but I needed third-party, unimpeachable proof. I started with the county assessor's website. Her property record listed the house as it was originally built. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, 2,800 square feet. There was no mention of the massive all-season sunroom I could clearly see attached to the back of her house from my own yard. I remembered when she'd had it built, about 2 years ago. It was a huge addition, on at least 400 square feet, with its own foundation and roof line tied into the main house. A project of that scale would absolutely require a building permit. I cross-referenced the county's permit database for her address going back 10 years. Nothing. Not for a sunroom, not for an electrical upgrade, not for a foundation. It was completely off the books. Then I went back to the HOA bylaws, the very document she wielded like a club. I found the section on setbacks. All permanent structures must be set back a minimum of 20 feet from the rear property line. I pulled up the official plat map for our cul-de-sac. Using the scale provided, I did a quick measurement. Her new sunroom wasn't just unpermitted, it extended a good 10 feet into the legally required setback. It was a blatant, undeniable violation of both city code and the HOA's own rules. This was the first pillar of her authority to crumble. She, the ultimate enforcer of the rules, was the biggest rule breaker of them all. But one violation wasn't a pattern, it was an anomaly. I needed more. I spent the next 2 days expanding my search. I used Google Maps satellite view and street view, cross-referencing what I saw with the permit database and the original blueprints for the entire neighborhood. I started a spreadsheet. The columns were address, homeowner, observed alteration, permit on file, Y/N, HOA bylaw violation. The list grew at an alarming rate. Lot 12, a new 2-car garage where the plans called for a carport, no permit. Lot 18, Brenda, the quiet board member, a massive backyard deck with a built-in kitchen, clearly violating the no permanent outdoor cooking structures rule. No permit. Lot 25, a 3rd-story dormer addition that was never on the original plans. No permit. What emerged was a clear picture. A significant number of homes, at least 30%, had major, unpermitted, and unapproved modifications. And there was a curious correlation. Almost all of them belonged to Karen's friends, her inner circle, who had been in the neighborhood for years. Meanwhile, the fines and violation notices I managed to find in the public HOA meeting minutes were almost exclusively levied against newer residents, for trivial things like leaving a basketball hoop out overnight or having the wrong color flowers in a window box. This wasn't just selective enforcement, it was a protection racket. You stay on Karen's good side. You can do whatever you want. You cross her, and she buries you in fines for the color of your mulch. The final piece of the puzzle was the plumbing. I went back to my logs, to the file on the water heater installations. I had the list of 150 homes, all installed with water heaters lacking the legally required thermal expansion tanks. This was my trump card, the one that went beyond bylaws and straight to public safety and massive liability. A water heater without an expansion tank can, under the right conditions, turn into a bomb. The pressure can build until the tank ruptures, releasing scalding water and steam with explosive force. It was a low probability, high consequence event, but the liability for the HOA, now that the developer was long gone, would be astronomical if even one of them failed catastrophically. The HOA's insurance would likely deny the claim due to a known, pre-existing code violation. The board, and by extension every homeowner, would be on the hook. I spent an entire afternoon drafting a series of documents. First, a formal complaint to the City Code Enforcement Office regarding the unpermitted sunroom at Lot 1, complete with satellite images, plat map analysis, and citations of the relevant municipal codes. I used the exact same format as the HOA's own violation notices, a small, satisfying piece of irony. Second, I began drafting a letter to the HOA board, this time with Tom's legal guidance. It was a formal notice of dispute, alleging capricious and arbitrary enforcement, breach of fiduciary duty, and harassment. We demanded that all fines against me be rescinded immediately. We demanded a full, independent financial audit of the HOA's books. And we formally put them on notice regarding the systemic code violation with the water heaters, citing the specific plumbing code and noting that the board was now aware of a significant and material risk to the residents. We attached my original email exchange with the developer where he assumed liability, and Tom added a legal opinion that this liability likely transferred to the HOA upon the community's completion. This was the legal equivalent of a targeted missile strike. It bypassed Karen's kangaroo court and went straight to the heart of the board's legal responsibilities. While I was assembling my arsenal, I knew I couldn't win this war alone. I needed allies. I thought about the faces in the clubhouse, the ones who looked away. They were afraid, but maybe they were also just waiting for a leader. I thought about who might be receptive. My eyes landed on a note in my original development file for Lot 34. The homeowner's name was Dave Riley. My note next to his name read, ex-Army, helped him unload his U-Haul. Good man. A fellow veteran. I knew where to start. I picked up the phone. Dave, I said when he answered, this is Mark Davis from down the street. I think you and I need to have a chat. It's about our queen, Karen, and the kingdom she's built. There was a pause and then a low chuckle on the other end of the line. It's about damn time someone said it out loud. When and where? The first crack in the dam had appeared. The first shot was fired digitally. I filled out the online complaint form on the city's code enforcement website. Uploading the meticulously prepared PDF about Karen's sunroom. I detailed the lack of permits, the setback violation, and attached the supporting documents, the plat map, the satellite photos, the section of the municipal code. It was anonymous, precise, and unstoppable. It was a bureaucratic missile, and I had just pushed the launch button. It would take a few days for the city's gears to grind, but the process had begun. Now for the ground war. I met Dave Riley at a small coffee shop a few towns over, far from the prying eyes of Oak Hollow. He was a retired Army sergeant major with a ramrod-straight posture and a no-nonsense gaze that I recognized instantly. We were cut from the same cloth, just different branches of the service. We didn't waste time with small talk. I laid it all out on the table. The shower, the $5,000 fine, the lien threat, and the results of my deep dive into the records. I showed him the spreadsheet of violations, highlighting the clear favoritism. I explained the unpermitted work, starting with Karen's own house. He listened intently, his expression hardening as I spoke. When I got to the part about the water heaters, he let out a low whistle. Son of a gun, he breathed, leaning back in his chair. You're not just fighting a fine, Mark. You've uncovered the entire rotten foundation of this place. She threatened my home, Dave, I said simply. That's a line you don't cross. Damn right, he agreed, his fist clenching on the table. I've been living here for 8 years and it's been death by 1,000 cuts. A nasty letter because my kid's bicycle was on the lawn. A warning because my flagpole was 2 inches too tall. I always just paid the little fines and complied because it was easier than fighting her. We all did. We let her build this little fiefdom because we were too busy, too tired, too intimidated. He looked me straight in the eye. But this, a $5,000 fine for a shower? A lien threat? That's not a rule enforcement. That's a declaration of war. What's the plan? The plan has two fronts, I said, sliding a folder across the table to him. Front one is legal. My son-in-law and I are preparing a formal demand letter to the board. It puts them on notice for everything: the selective enforcement, the financial mismanagement, the water heater liability. It's designed to scare the hell out of the other two board members and isolate Karen. Good, he grunted, nodding. On in front two? Is a hearts and minds campaign, I continued. You and I can't be the only ones she's pushed too far. We need to find them. We need to build a coalition. We need to show them they're not alone, and we need to show them we have the ammunition to win this. Dave grinned, a real wolfish grin. Hearts and minds. I know a thing or two about that. There are a few people I can trust. The Rodriguezes at number 42, Karen gave them hell for months because they wanted to install a small ramp for their elderly mother. The Lees at 28, they got fined because their son's graduation party was too loud. People are simmering, Mark. They just need a reason to boil over. We spent the next hour mapping out the neighborhood, identifying potential allies. We decided to start small, with a private meeting at my house. No emails, no flyers. Just quiet, face-to-face conversations. Over the next few days, while we waited for the legal letter to be finalized, Dave and I became quiet insurgents. We went for walks after dinner, accidentally running into the people on our list. We'd start with simple complaints about the lawn service or the rising HOA dues, gauging their reactions. If they were receptive, we'd gently pivot. You know, I was talking to Mark Davis the other day. Did you hear what happened to him at the last board meeting? The stories started pouring out. A fine for a satellite dish that was visible from an oblique angle from the adjacent property. A demand to remove a non-native dogwood tree. A notice of violation for holiday lights that were still up on January 2nd. Each story was a piece of the mosaic, a testament to Karen's reign of petty tyranny. It was exactly as David said. People were simmering. They had been isolated, picked off one by one, made to feel like they were the only ones causing trouble. Our quiet conversations were the first sign that they weren't alone. The meeting was set for a Thursday night. We had 7 people confirmed, including Dave and me. It wasn't an army, but it was a platoon. It was a start. That afternoon, as I was preparing my notes for the meeting, I saw it. A crisp, white City of Oak Hollow official vehicle pulling up to the curb at the top of the cul-de-sac. A man in a uniform shirt with a clipboard got out and walked directly to Karen's front door. I watched from my window as he knocked. Karen answered, her initial welcoming smile fading as he spoke, and handed her a piece of paper. Even from 100 yards away, I could see the color drain from her face. She started gesturing wildly, pointing at other houses, her body language screaming indignation. The inspector just stood there, shook his head, made a note on his clipboard, and walked back to his truck. He paused, took a few pictures of the sunroom with his phone, and then drove away. The first missile had hit its target. The anonymous complaint had worked. Karen now had her own official violation notice to deal with, not from her own little HOA, but from the city, from a power even she couldn't ignore. She stood on her porch for a long time, the paper crushed in her fist. Then her head turned, and she scanned the cul-de-sac, her eyes sweeping over each house, searching for the traitor. Her gaze lingered on my house for a moment, and I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding with a grim satisfaction. She didn't know for sure it was me, but she suspected. The war was no longer cold. Karen's retaliation was swift and brutish, lacking any of the surgical precision I had employed. It was the flailing of a wounded animal. The morning after the city inspector's visit, I found not one, but 3 new violation notices taped to my front door. It was a paper fusillade, One was for improperly stored garden implements, citing a trowel and a pair of gloves I had left on my porch railing to dry. Fine, $100. The second was for non-conforming landscape bordering, because the river stones I used around my flower beds were apparently not of a uniform size and color as befitting community standards. Fine, $250. Ever the third was the most absurd of all. Excessive and unapproved irrigation, with a grainy photo attached, taken at night of my sprinkler system in operation. It claimed I was watering outside the approved hours, which was nonsense. My system was on a timer set to the exact schedule mandated in the HOA's own newsletter. Fine, $500. It was harassment, plain and simple. It was punitive and personal. She was trying to bury me, to bleed me dry with 1,000 paper cuts, just as she had done to so many others. But I wasn't like the others. I didn't get angry. I got organized. I photographed the notices, logged them in a new spreadsheet titled Harassment, and filed them away in my evidence binder. Each absurd fine was another nail in her coffin, another piece of proof for the pattern of abuse Tom had told me to establish. That evening, had the small group of disgruntled homeowners gathered in my living room. There was Dave, the Rodriguezes, the Lees, and a young couple named the Chings, who had been cited for their child's brightly colored playset. The mood was tense, a mixture of fear and defiant hope. They had all heard about my showdown at the HOA meeting and the subsequent avalanche of fines. They saw me as either a fool or a hero, and they weren't sure which yet. I didn't start with war stories. I started with facts. I had set up a small projector, and the first image I put on the wall was the plat map of Karen's property with the setback lines clearly marked in red and the footprint of her illegal sunroom shaded in. "This is Karen's house," I said quietly, "and this is her sunroom, which violates Section 9 of the bylaws she claims to hold so sacred. It's also an unpermitted structure for which she has now been cited by the city." A murmur went through the room. They had all seen the city truck. Now they knew why it was there. Next, I showed them the spreadsheet of unpermitted work throughout the neighborhood, color-coded to show the correlation between violators and their relationship with Karen. I showed them the list of trivial fines levied against newer residents. It was all there, in black and white. The pattern was undeniable. "She's not enforcing the rules," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice trembling with anger. "She's using them as a weapon against anyone she doesn't like." "Exactly," I said. "Her authority is built on a lie. The lie is that she is an impartial enforcer of rules that apply to everyone equally. The moment we prove that's false, her power evaporates." Then, I brought out the heavy artillery. I explained the situation with the water heaters. I didn't use technical jargon. I put it in simple terms. There is a safety device required by city code that is missing from the water heater in almost every single house in this neighborhood, including all of ours. It was a cost-cutting measure by the developer. I have the documentation to prove it. In a worst-case scenario, a water heater without this device can fail catastrophically. I let that sink in. The fear in the room was palpable now, but it was a different kind of fear. It wasn't fear of Karen anymore. It was fear of liability, of financial ruin, of physical danger. The developer is long gone, I continued. The liability for this, should anything happen, now rests with the HOA, with the board, with Karen. The moment we formally notify them of this defect, which my lawyer is preparing to do, they are knowingly and willfully ignoring a massive safety and financial risk. Their insurance will drop them. Every homeowner will be exposed. Dave stood up. "Mark has a plan," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "He's not just complaining. He's built a case. He's got the evidence to take her down. But he can't do it alone. The board will just dismiss him as one disgruntled homeowner, but they can't dismiss all of us." Mr. Lee, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "What do you need from us?" "First," I said, "we need to form a united front. We're creating a Concerned Homeowners of Oak Hollow Committee, unofficially for now. We need to pool our resources. My son-in-law is providing his legal help pro bono, but there may be filing fees, or other costs." "I'm in," Mr. Rodriguez said immediately, pulling out his checkbook. "How much?" One by one, they all committed. We weren't just a group of complainers anymore. We were an organization. Second, I continued, I need information. I need every violation notice, every threatening email, every story of harassment you have. We need to build a mountain of evidence so high that no one can ignore it. For the next hour, the stories flowed. People who had been afraid to speak were now comparing notes, their individual grievances coalescing into a collective indictment. The Lees had photos of Karen peering over their fence during their son's party. Mrs. Rodriguez had a saved voicemail where Karen's voice dripped with condescension about the unsightly accessibility ramp. Where the Chengs had an email demanding they repaint their child's garish playset in an approved shade of beige. It was a treasure trove of tyranny. As the meeting wrapped up, a sense of empowerment had replaced the fear. They left my house not as victims, but as co-conspirators in a rebellion. After they were gone, Dave stayed behind to help me clean up. You did good, Mark, he said, clapping me on the shoulder. You gave them hope, but you also painted a big, bright target on your back. He was right. The next morning, a tow truck was parked in front of my house. The driver was hooking up my 1986 Ford F-150, my old reliable work truck that I kept parked on the street, perfectly legally. I ran outside. What's going on? I demanded. The driver, a young kid, looked uncomfortable. Got a call to tow it. It's in violation. Yeah, leaking oil. I looked under the truck. The pavement was bone dry. There wasn't a single drop of oil, but tucked under my windshield wiper was another notice. This one on official HOA letterhead with a checkbox next to hazardous vehicle. The fine was $1,000 plus the cost of the tow. It was signed by Karen. She hadn't even bothered to invent a plausible reason. She was just lashing out, using her power to physically remove my property. This was a new level of escalation. It was no longer about paper. It was about property. I looked at the tow truck driver. Unhook my truck, I said, my voice low and cold. I can't do that, man. The HOA already paid. Unhook it, I repeated, or your next call is going to be from my lawyer, and the one after that will be from the police. Reporting a grand theft auto in progress. The kid's eyes went wide. He looked from me to the pristine pavement under the truck, then back at me. He made a decision. All right, man. Geez. He unhooked my truck, got in his cab, and drove off without a word. I stood in the street, the fraudulent notice in my hand. This was her mistake. This was the overreach I had been waiting for. She had just escalated from bureaucratic harassment to an illegal act. And I had a witness. The queen was losing her composure. And a queen who loses her composure is a queen who loses her head. The attempted towing of my truck was a tactical error on Karen's part. It was a move born of panic, not strategy, and it gave us exactly the opening we needed. Tom, my son-in-law, was practically giddy when I told him. This is perfect, he said over the phone. Inura, this elevates it beyond bylaw disputes. This is attempted theft and tortious interference with property. She used the HOA's funds to hire a company to illegally seize your vehicle based on a fabricated violation. The other board members, Gary and Brenda, are now complicit in a criminal act, whether they knew it or not. The final pieces of our legal strategy clicked into place. The demand letter we had been drafting was no longer just a request, it was a threat. Tom spent the weekend refining it, turning it into a legal masterpiece. It was a 14-page document that methodically laid out our case. It began by detailing the initial dispute over the shower, the punitive and escalating fines, and the rigged appeal process. It then pivoted to the pattern of harassment, listing every single bogus violation notice I had received, and culminating in the illegal towing attempt. It included sworn affidavits from me and the tow truck driver, who, after a brief conversation with Tom, was more than happy to provide a statement in exchange for immunity from any legal action. The letter then broadened its scope, presenting the evidence our new committee had gathered. The sworn statements from the Rodriguezes, the Lees, and the Chengs, complete with photographs, emails, and voicemails. It demonstrated, with overwhelming evidence, a clear pattern of selective and malicious enforcement. Finally, it delivered the two finishing blows. It formally notified the board of the systemic plumbing code violations regarding the water heaters, attaching my expert analysis, a copy of the relevant city code, and the developer's email assuming liability. It explicitly stated that the board was now considered to be grossly negligent if they failed to act immediately to assess and rectify the situation, opening them up to immense personal liability. The final section was the list of demands. First, immediate rescission of all fines and violations against me and all other homeowners who had provided testimony. Second, the immediate resignation of Karen Miller as president of the board. Third, a full independent financial audit of the HOA's books for the past 5 years to be overseen by a third-party accounting firm chosen by the Concerned Homeowners Committee. Fourth, a special meeting of the homeowners to be called within 30 days for the purpose of electing a new board. The letter concluded with a simple to brutal sentence. Should the board of directors fail to comply with all of the above demands within 10 business days of receipt of this letter, a lawsuit will be filed against the Homeowners Association for breach of fiduciary duty and against Karen Miller, Gary Peterson, and Brenda Howe personally for damages related to harassment, conspiracy, and tortious interference. We were no longer asking, we were telling. On Monday morning, I didn't mail the letter. I delivered it myself. I walked up to Karen's house, the same house where the city's violation notice was now taped to the front window, and slid a thick envelope into her mail slot. I then drove to Gary's house and Brenda's house and did the same. There would be no claiming they never received it. While the 10-day clock started ticking, we moved on to the next phase of the operation, a public information campaign. We needed to control the narrative. We created a simple one-page flyer. It didn't mention me or my shower. It was titled, "Are you aware of the risks in your home?" It explained in simple, non-alarming terms the issue with the water heaters. It cited the city code. It mentioned the potential for property damage and the serious liability the HOA now faced. It didn't point fingers. It simply stated facts and invited homeowners to a special informational meeting at the community park on Saturday morning to discuss urgent matters of community safety and financial liability. Dave and his small team of volunteers distributed the flyers after dark, placing one on every doorstep in the neighborhood. It was a psychological operation, and the goal was to create a groundswell of concern that was separate from my personal fight with Karen. It was no longer about Mark's shower. It was about everyone's safety and everyone's money. The reaction was immediate. The neighborhood's private social media page, which Karen usually ran with an iron fist, exploded with questions. Is this flyer for real? Can my water heater really explode? Why hasn't the board told us about this? Karen, in a panic, tried to delete the posts, but they kept reappearing faster than she could remove them. She then posted a frantic, all-caps message. Ignore the anonymous and irresponsible flyer that is being circulated. It is filled with misinformation designed to scare you by a disgruntled homeowner. The board has all matters under control. It was the worst possible thing she could have done. The denial, combined with the condescending tone, was gasoline on the fire. People who might have been skeptical of the flyer were now convinced it was true. Why else would she try so hard to suppress it? 2 days before our planned park meeting, I got a call from an unknown number. "Is this Mark Davis?" the voice asked. It was Gary, the nervous board member. He sounded terrified. "We need to talk," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not on the phone. Can you meet me?" We met in a Starbucks parking lot. He practically crawled out of his car, looking over his shoulder as if he expected Karen to pop out from behind a minivan. He was holding our demand letter, his hands shaking. "I didn't know," he stammered. "I didn't know about the towing thing. She just said you were a problem and we had to be firm. And this water heater thing, when is it true?" "Every word of it," I said, my voice flat. "I have the installation logs for all 150 houses, including yours, Gary." He swallowed hard. "The lawsuit, suing us personally, my wife would kill me. I'm a retired accountant. I can't afford a lawsuit." "Then you have a choice to make," I said, looking him in the eye. "You can go down with her ship, or you can help us right it. We have the support, we have the evidence. This is happening with or without you. But you and Brenda could make it a lot less messy by calling for the special meeting and supporting the motion to remove her." He stared at the letter in his hands, at the specter of his own financial ruin. "She'll destroy me," he whispered. "She's got nothing left to destroy you with," I countered. Her credibility is shot. Her authority is a joke. Right now, why she's the one who's drowning, and she's trying to drag you and Brenda down with her. It's time to save yourself." He looked up at me, a flicker of resolve in his terrified eyes. He was a weak man, but even weak men will fight when they're cornered. "What do I need to do?" he asked. The tide was turning, not with a roar, but with a whisper in a parking lot. The Saturday morning informational meeting in the park was a turning point. We had set up a few folding tables with coffee and donuts, expecting maybe 30 or 40 people. Over 100 showed up. The flyer, combined with Karen's frantic attempts to suppress the discussion, had ignited a firestorm of curiosity and concern. The entire community, it seemed, was hungry for information. Dave and I stood before them, not as antagonists, but as concerned neighbors. And I had my blueprints and my logbook spread out on one of the tables, a visual testament to the depth of my knowledge. I took the lead, my voice calm and steady. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I know there's been a lot of confusion and concern over the past week, and we wanted to create a forum to answer your questions openly and honestly, something the current HOA board has refused to do." I didn't mention Karen by name. I didn't have to. Everyone knew who I was talking about. I started by explaining, in my capacity as a master plumber who worked on the original construction, the technical details of the water heater issue. I showed them the diagrams, explained the function of a thermal expansion tank, and read the specific section of the city plumbing code. I presented it not as an accusation, but as a technical problem that needed a solution. "This is not about scaring anyone," I said. "The risk of a catastrophic failure is low, but the risk is not zero, and the financial liability for the community, now that this issue is known, is 100%. Our HOA's insurance will not cover claims resulting from a known, unaddressed code violation. That means if a tank fails and floods a home, the cost of repairs comes out of our collective pockets, either through a massive special assessment or a lawsuit that makes our dues skyrocket." You could hear a pin drop. I was speaking their language now, the language of money, of property values, of liability. These were the very things Karen always claimed to be protecting, and I was showing them how her negligence had put them all at risk. Then Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward. "It's not just about the water heaters," he said, his voice strong. "It's about the abuse. This board, under Karen Miller's leadership, has been terrorizing people for years." He told the story of the accessibility ramp for his mother, how Karen had made them feel like criminals for trying to care for a disabled family member. Then Mrs. Lee spoke up about her son's graduation party, and the Chungs talked about the ridiculous demands concerning their child's playset. It was a floodgate opening. For the first time, these stories were being told in public, in the light of day, creating a powerful shared narrative of injustice. The crowd was no longer just concerned. They were angry. "What can we do?" someone yelled from the back. Dave stepped forward. "According to the bylaws," he announced, his voice booming with his old sergeant major authority, "a special meeting of the homeowners can be called by the board or by a petition signed by 25% of the homeowners. At that meeting, we can vote on any matter, including the removal of a board member and the election of a new one." He held up a stack of papers on a clipboard. "We have the petition right here. We need 38 signatures. Let's get this done." A line formed instantly. People were practically grabbing the pen from each other's hands to sign. Within 20 minutes, we had over 70 signatures, nearly double what we needed. While this was happening, I saw a car pull up to the edge of the park. It was Brenda, the other board member. She sat in her car for a long moment, watching the scene unfold. The huge crowd, the petitions being signed, had the palpable sense of rebellion in the air. She had the same look of dawning horror that Gary had worn. The demand letter was clearly on her mind. After a few minutes, she got out of her car and walked hesitantly towards me. "Mr. Davis," she said, her voice tight. "Gary called me. He told me everything." "Then you know what's at stake," I replied. "I'm a retired school teacher," she said, wringing her hands. "I just wanted to help with the community garden. I never signed up for lawsuits. Karen told me you were a troublemaker trying to get out of a legitimate fine." "Do these people look like troublemakers?" I asked, gesturing to the crowd of her neighbors, doctors, teachers, accountants, parents, all united against the board she sat on. She lied to us, Brenda. She used us. She put us all at risk, legally and financially. Brenda looked at the crowd, then back at me, her face pale. The special meeting, she said. If Gary and I call for it, instead of the petition, it can happen faster. The bylaws say the board has to give 10 days notice. That would be a sign of good faith, I said, my tone even. It would show that you and Gary are interested in solving this, not covering it up. She nodded, a decision solidifying in her eyes. I'll talk to Gary. We'll post the notice for the meeting this afternoon, 10 days from tonight in the clubhouse. She turned and walked back to her car, a woman who had just chosen a side. The trap was now fully set. We had the law on our side, we had the public on our side, and now we had the board's own members fracturing. The final confrontation was inevitable. Karen could no longer hide behind her procedures or her position. She was going to have to face the very people she had ruled over, and she was going to have to answer for everything. The 10-day waiting period was a time of immense tension. She was cornered, and we didn't know how she would react. Would she resign? Would she try some last-ditch legal maneuver? Or would she, as I suspected, double down, convinced of her own righteousness to the very end? The answer came in the form of a letter from her lawyer, a response to our demand letter. It was a masterpiece of blustering denial. It called our claims frivolous and defamatory. It stated that the board had acted within its rights at all times. It dismissed the water heater issue as unsubstantiated fear-mongering by a non-expert. The part about me being a non-expert in plumbing made me laugh out loud. The letter was a declaration that she intended to fight. She was going to walk into that special meeting expecting to crush a peasant rebellion. She had no idea she was walking into her own public trial. The night of the special meeting, the clubhouse was packed beyond capacity. People stood along the walls and spilled out into the hallway. The air was thick with anticipation. It felt less like an HOA meeting and more like a town hall on the eve of a revolution. Dave, the Rodriguezes, the Lees, and I had secured seats in the front row. We were a united front. Tom, my son-in-law, sat with us, a thick binder of documents on his lap, yet ready to act as our legal counsel and parliamentarian if needed. Karen, Gary, and Brenda took their seats at the head table. Gary and Brenda looked pale and grim, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Karen, however, was a study in defiant self-assurance. She wore a severe black pantsuit, like armor, and her face was set in a mask of imperious disdain. She clearly intended to preside over this meeting, as she had all others, by force of will. She banged the gavel. This special meeting of the Oak Hollow Homeowners Association is now in session, she announced, her voice sharp. This meeting was called at the request of board members Peterson and Howe to address certain rumors that have been circulating. Let me be clear. This board has always acted in the best interests of the community and its property values. And we are here tonight to dispel the malicious misinformation campaign launched by a single disgruntled homeowner who refuses to follow the same rules as the rest of us. She was trying to frame the narrative right from the start, to paint me as the villain one last time. It didn't work. A low murmur of dissent rippled through the crowd. Gary, looking sick, leaned into his microphone. Actually, Madam President, he began, his voice shaky but audible. The first order of business, according to the notice, is a motion. Karen shot him a look of pure venom. What motion, Gary? A motion for the removal of the current HOA president, Karen Miller, for cause due to gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and a pattern of harassment against members of the association. Gary read from a prepared script, not looking at her. The room erupted. Aunt Karen banged the gavel repeatedly. Order! Order! This is out of order. There is no basis for such a motion. Tom stood up. Madam President, he said, his voice calm and authoritative, according to your own bylaws, Article 3, Section 4, any board member can be removed for cause by a majority vote of the homeowners present at a duly called special meeting. This is a legitimate motion. It must be seconded and put to a vote. Brenda, her hands trembling, leaned forward. I second the motion. It was done. The mutiny was official. Karen was speechless, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. She had lost control of her own board. This is absurd, she finally sputtered. On what grounds? What cause? I stood up. All eyes turned to me. I believe I can provide the grounds, I said, holding a folder. May I approach? Karen looked like she wanted to physically stop me, but the eyes of 100 homeowners were on her. She gave a curt, angry nod. I walked to the front and took the residence podium, facing the crowd, my back to the board. I didn't want this to be about me versus her. I wanted this to be me presenting evidence to the jury. The cause, I began, is a complete and total failure to uphold the duties you were elected to perform. The cause is the weaponization of our bylaws to harass and intimidate residents. The cause is the hypocrisy of punishing your neighbors for minor infractions while ignoring your own major violations. I clicked a remote, and the projector I had set up earlier sprang to life. The first image on the screen behind the board was the satellite photo of Karen's house, her illegal, an unpermitted sunroom highlighted in red. This is a picture of our president's home. The sunroom you see was built without city permits and in direct violation of the HOA's own setback rules. While Mrs. Miller was fining Mr. and Mrs. Cheng for the color of their child's playset, she was hiding a 400-square-foot illegal addition. The crowd gasped. I clicked again. A spreadsheet appeared, listing a dozen other major, unpermitted additions, all belonging to Karen's friends, next to a list of the petty fines levied against everyone else. This is the selective enforcement that the board's own lawyer called frivolous. Does this look frivolous to you? I asked the crowd. No, they shouted back. And then there is the harassment, I said, my voice dropping. I clicked through slides showing the notices for my garden trowel or for my river rocks, the fraudulent order to tow my truck. I played the audio from the voicemail Karen left Mrs. Rodriguez, her condescending tone filling the room. Each piece of evidence was met with angry murmurs. Karen was shrinking in her chair, her face ashen. I had saved the worst for last. But all of this pales in comparison to the final charge: gross negligence. For years, the board, under Mrs. Miller's leadership, has ignored a critical safety issue that puts every single one of us at risk. I brought up the diagram of the water heater. As the plumber who installed the systems in this development, I can state as an expert that 150 homes in Oak Hollow were built with a ticking time bomb in their utility closets, a missing, legally required safety device. I formally notified the board of this risk 10 days ago. Their response, from their lawyer, was to call my expert opinion unsubstantiated fear-mongering. I held up the lawyer's letter. They didn't investigate. They didn't warn you. They didn't consult another expert. They just denied it. They willfully and negligently ignored a threat to our homes and our safety, all to protect their own position. I turned to face Karen directly. You had a duty of care, and you failed. You had a duty to be fair, and you were corrupt. You had a duty to protect this community, and you endangered it. That is the cause. I turned back to the crowd. The motion is on the floor to remove her. I ask you to vote aye. The room was silent for a beat, and then the sound was deafening. Aye! It wasn't just a vote. It was a roar of catharsis, a collective voice of people taking back their community. Dave stood up. One all in favor of the motion to remove Karen Miller as president, say aye. The roar came again, shaking the room. Aye. All opposed, Dave called out. Silence. Utter, complete silence. Not a single voice rose to defend her. Even Karen just sat there stunned, her reign over in an instant. The motion carries, Dave announced into the microphone. Karen Miller is hereby removed from the HOA Board of Directors. Just then, as if on cue, the doors to the clubhouse opened. Two uniformed city officials walked in. One was the building inspector from before. The other was a fire marshal. The inspector walked straight up to the head table and handed Karen another official document. Karen Miller, he said, his voice loud in the now quiet room, you are hereby served with a stop work order for the unpermitted structure at your residence. In and due to the willful continuation of its use after the initial citation, you are being fined $500 per day, retroactive to the date of my first visit. Furthermore, we have received a credible report of systemic plumbing code violations throughout this development. The fire marshal's office will be requiring a full inspection of every home's water heater system to be paid for by the responsible party, which in this case appears to be the HOA. The final, beautiful, crushing blow. Not only was she removed from power, but her negligence was now going to cost the very HOA she once controlled a fortune, a mess the new board would have to clean up. She had been so obsessed with my $3,000 shower that she had ignored the $500,000 liability she was sitting on. It was perfect. The aftermath of the meeting was like the breaking of a long fever. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over Oak Hollow for years dissipated overnight. Karen didn't just lose her presidency, she lost her power, her status, and the fear she had so carefully cultivated. Stripped of her authority, she was just an angry woman in a house with an illegal and now very expensive sunroom. She put her house on the market less than a month later, selling it at a discount to a buyer who was fully informed of the unpermitted addition and the cost to either legalize it or tear it down. I never saw her again. At a subsequent meeting, a new board was elected. Dave Riley was unanimously voted in as the new president. Mr. Rodriguez became the treasurer and Mrs. Lee the secretary. Their first official act was to pass a motion to void every fine and violation notice issued by Karen's board in the past year. My $5,000 fine, the fines for the Chung's playset, the Rodriguez's ramp, all of it vanished with a single vote. Their second act was to hire my company, Semper Fi Plumbing, to manage the water heater remediation project. It was a massive undertaking. We went house by house, inspecting each unit and installing the required thermal expansion tanks. The HOA, under Dave's transparent leadership, had negotiated a bulk rate with my supplier and communicated the plan clearly to every homeowner. Instead of a massive special assessment, they were able to cover the cost using the HOA's reserve funds. Funds that the new independent audit revealed had been surprisingly healthy, despite Karen's opaque financial reports. It seemed she was more interested in power than outright theft. It took my team and me 2 months of steady work to get all 150 homes up to code. It was satisfying work, fixing a problem I had been forced to create 15 years prior. It was like closing a loop, making things right not just for the community, but for my own sense of professional integrity. During this time, the entire culture of the neighborhood changed. The ARC, or Architectural Review Committee, was reformed with new members and new, clearer guidelines. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to collaborative problem solving. People started talking to each other more, helping each other with yard work, and the oppressive sense of being watched was replaced by a genuine sense of community. And the neighborhood social media page became a place for organizing block parties and sharing contractor recommendations, not for anonymous accusations. One warm Saturday afternoon, after finishing the last water heater installation, I came home tired, but deeply satisfied. I stripped off my work clothes, walked out to my backyard, and stepped into my outdoor shower. The cedar had weathered to a beautiful silvery gray, and the jasmine had almost completely covered the lattice screen, its sweet scent hanging in the air. As the cool water washed away the sweat and grime of the day, I looked up at the clear blue sky. It was more than just a shower now. It was a symbol. It was a monument to the idea that one person, armed with the truth and a little bit of specialized knowledge, could indeed fight City Hall, or in this case, a tyrannical HOA. It was a testament to the fact that justice, like good plumbing, sometimes requires you to get your hands dirty, to trace the problem back to its source, and to systematically replace the rotten pipes with something that will hold up under pressure. My phone rang. I saw it was my daughter, Jessica. I dried my hand and answered. "Hey, Dad, how'd the last installation go?" "All done," I said, a smile in my voice. "Oak Hollow is officially up to code." "That's great. Hey, Lily has a question for you." I heard some shuffling, and then my granddaughter's small voice came on the line. "Grandpa, can you teach me how to build a treehouse? A really, really tall one?" I laughed. "Absolutely, sweetheart. But first, we're going to have to draw up some plans and submit them to the Architectural Review Committee." Jessica laughed on the other end of the line. "Dad, stop. Dave's the president now, remember? I think he'll approve it." "I know," I said, looking around at the quiet, peaceful yard that I had fought for. "But there are rules, and this time, we're going to follow them, because we can." The victory wasn't just in defeating Karen. It was in restoring the principle that the rules were there to serve the community, not the other way around. My little corner of the world was safe, it was fair, and it was finally, truly my own. And the water pressure in my outdoor shower was absolutely perfect.